We do know that this is something that is going to be developing throughout the evening. We don't know a whole lot yet. Joe Truzman joining us. And Joe, let's just start off with what we do know so far. Here's what Trey Yingst is saying. The strikes are meant to send a message of deterrence, and there was communication with the Americans ahead of the strikes over the past several days. Does anything jump out to you about what you're reading?
Right. Obviously, we've known that at least the Israelis have been saying for several weeks now that they were going to retaliate against Iran, right? And this retaliation is of course due to the ballistic missile attack that Iran launched against the Jewish state several weeks ago. So now what we're seeing is Israel's words essentially come into action, right? So it's not a surprise that Iran, or rather the Israelis, are attacking Iran. And actually, just a few moments ago, and you may be talking about this too, the IDF officially acknowledged that they were striking Iran at this moment. So not only do we have the reports from media sources like Trey, but the Israeli Defense Forces have now officially confirmed that they are striking Iran. So this is a big moment. This is a big moment for the Israelis. This is something the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli military and their intelligence agencies have been working on for many years, right? But it at least appears right now, we don't know exactly what the targets that may have been hit by the Israelis. We're not aware since this just happened. So there's still a lot to unpack here, and I think this is going to be ongoing for a little while right now.
Did Israel take responsibility earlier this year when they did their first retaliatory response to Iran?
Yeah, I believe so. But I think that was just a little different, right? I think in that case, it was more what they ended up doing was just they hit an air defense site near one of Iran's nuclear facilities. So this was just one target, okay? This seems, at least according to the initial reports that I've been seeing, is that this is a little bit more, I would say, widespread. But we don't know what has been hit. We don't know if it's military installations. We don't know if it's oil refineries, for example. So we'll still have to wait. But I think this is going to be a little more widespread than the one before it, than the previous Israeli strike.
So let's catch up the folks at home. So this attack, we assume, was delayed after some documents were leaked. Can you catch us up about what happened before today?
Yeah. So specifically with these documents, I think it was last week, some intelligence documents that essentially detailed some of Israel's weapons that they may be using against Iran in a potential strike was essentially leaked, this classified document, okay, detailing some of these weapons. I think they were dated October 16th, October 17th. So it's pretty recent. This document, or these documents rather, they leaked online, and reportedly, at least, it caused a delay in the strike. Because essentially what the document was telling or was saying is what Israel was going to use against Iran as far as weapons, right? And of course, that would cause problems for the Israeli military, at least may cause them to rethink about how they would strike Iran. So it wouldn't surprise me if it delayed things. But now, as we're seeing, it looks like they are attacking Iran.
So we're looking at a live image of northern Israel right now. I'll read a little bit of the reporting because Defense Minister Yoav Gallant vowed a precise and deadly response to the more than 180 missiles that Iran targeted Israel with back on October 1st, many of them, of course, being intercepted or simply just not making it there. What has the U.S. said? What has their 2 cents been about how Israel should carry this out? Or maybe the better question is, what has the U.S. said they didn't want Israel to target?
Yeah, those are very good points. I think the U.S., especially President Biden, didn't, at least a couple of things, right? He did not want the Israelis to go after Iran's nuclear sites. And he didn't, I don't think he wanted or rather for Israel to go after Iran's oil industry as well. We have to remember too, this is just maybe an example of what could have happened, right? Or what can happen. But let's say the Israelis attack an oil refinery or multiple oil refineries in Iran. That could have a negative effect, not only in the region, but across the world, right? It could, oil prices could spike. So it would affect a lot, it would affect everyone essentially. So I think those at least those two items, those two industries, right, nuclear and oil. I think that's what the Biden administration wanted the Israelis to go to stay away from. But listen, there are a lot of more targets available for the Israelis, right? Especially targets, military installations, especially those ones belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the IRGC. So I think I would strongly suspect at least that we're going to hear about IRGC sites and other military installations, Iranian installations being hit in these strikes.
So we're hearing from the IDF, and here's your tweet showing some of what the IDF has said. We have their full statement. I'll read it. In response to months of continuous attacks from the regime in Iran against the state of Israel, right now the IDF is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. The regime in Iran and its proxies in the region have been relentlessly attacking Israel since October 7th on 7 fronts, including direct attacks from Iranian soil. Like every other sovereign country in the world, the state of Israel has the right and the duty to respond. Our defensive and offensive capabilities are fully mobilized. We will do whatever necessary to defend the state of Israel and the people of Israel. Is there anything to take from their words today?
Right. There's several important takes, right? It's their right and their duty to respond. I think the Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari is absolutely correct there. We have to remember when he says 7 fronts, all right, he's speaking about Iran's network of proxies and clients that they surround the state of Israel. They're in the West Bank, they're in Lebanon, they're obviously in Gaza, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. So this is what he's saying here, that Iran is using its proxies and its clients in the region to attack Israel. But of course, I think all of this was precipitated by Iran's, as you mentioned earlier, Iran's ballistic missile attack on the Jewish state several weeks ago. So he's absolutely right here. And remember, Israel back in April, they could have retaliated in a stronger fashion when Iran launched ballistic missile, their first ballistic missile attack on the Israelis. But the Israelis never really did. Now they are responding. So I think everything that Hagari is saying is correct, and especially about the duty to respond. So I think it's a strong message to Iran.
So it says there, right now the IDF is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. So they're not being specific about what exactly is being targeted. Do you expect that information? The better question is probably, when do you expect? How long does it take this type of information to come out?
Well, I think a lot of times that what we see, this information first comes out either like on social media, right, of actual people on the ground. But I think eventually, either it would be most likely that the IDF spokesperson will actually give a briefing, okay, and say, okay, this is what we targeted. So I expect it to come out as far as what targets were hit or by the Israelis. I think the IDF will let us know. When that will happen, of course, we don't know. We may hear something from the Iranian state-controlled media as well, but I think you'll probably hear something more in detail from the Israelis.
So is the goal with a retaliatory operation like this to send a message, yet not escalate this thing any further than we need it to?
Right. I think what the Israelis are trying to do here is, of course, a message of deterrence. Now, are the Iranians going to be deterred from the strike? I can't say for sure, but I think the Israelis are at least saying right now that they're not going. They're going for if the Iranians attack further, or you see more ballistic missile attacks from the Iranians, that Israel will respond harshly. So I think also it's very important here. Something we don't know right now is what has been hit. Right, what the Israelis have hit, we just don't know. So I think, yes, a message of deterrence is what the Israelis are trying to at least project here. But I don't know if it will work. It just a lot of it depends on what was hit.
And what do you expect? And this may be the big question here: is another goal here that they don't want Iran to retaliate to the retaliation? Is that something that they're going to have? Is that a calculation that they're likely trying to make with this type of strike?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is why they choose their targets carefully, as we spoke about before. Nuclear sites, oil sites, right? I think if those are kept off limits by the Israelis, it's very possible that Iran won't retaliate. But also, there's Iranian regime figures or senior figures, right, within the regime. I think if they are targeted by the Israelis in this strike, that Iran would be compelled to respond. So a lot of this depends on what the Israelis hit, right? What they've targeted, and we don't know that yet. But I do think the Israelis limited their strikes. Okay, so the Iranians won't respond, right? Because the Biden administration does not want an Iran-Israel war, and I don't think Iran nor Israel want a war between the two countries as well. So I think these strikes are going to be limited, but we just need to see what was hit.
All right. And Joe, I do also want to bring in national security analyst and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. If both of you will stand by, I'd like to discuss this with Hal, too. Hal, this is something that you and I have been discussing for weeks now. What little we do know at this point, and again, I'll just reset and I'll read what we're hearing from the IDF. This is from Daniel Hagari. Here's what they say. In response to months of continuous attacks from the regime in Iran against the state of Israel, right now, the IDF is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. The regime in Iran and its proxies in the region have been relentlessly attacking Israel since October 7th on 7 fronts, including direct attacks from Iranian soil. Like every other sovereign country in the world, the state of Israel has the right and the duty to respond. Our defensive and offensive capabilities are fully mobilized. We will do whatever necessary to defend the state of Israel and the people of Israel. Lucas Tomlinson saying the White House was notified a short time before Israel launched its strikes on Iran. Hal, what can we make so far from these preliminary details?
Well, Austin, initially, and there is some reporting, I just saw Axios had a little bit more detail. There's been reports of strikes around Iran, but particularly in Tehran itself. And the fact that there's strikes in Tehran indicates more likely than not they were going after what I would call command and control targets. I don't know what those targets are, but probably something, inferably because of the ballistic missile threat and the drone threat, inferably something tied with the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. That would be my inference from that, as they're hitting key command and control communication hubs, if you will, sites, headquarters. There's also symbolic value in doing that because that is the part of the Iranian regime that controls the ballistic missile threat, and for the most part, the drone threat, what attacked Israel. So that would make sense. And I kind of stick to what we talked about earlier, which was that they're going to go after air defense facilities, air defense sites, regardless. If you're doing strike missions, whether it's short-term or long-term, in the short term, you want to suppress enemy air defense. And if you're going to do it over a period of time, and we just don't know how long these series of strikes will take, you would want to destroy enemy air defenses to leave huge gaps that leave them wide open. It's another way of saying you have a negotiating leverage or negotiation leverage on them, which could, you say, hey, look, either we're going to come to terms or we're going to keep hitting you. And that's kind of what I would anticipate at this point, that Israel has weighed heavily. I don't know exactly what they've hit, but if you're hitting in Tehran, there is certain inferences that can be taken from that. You're not hitting, if you're hitting in Tehran, you're probably not hitting a nuclear site, and you're probably not hitting an oil refinery. And I think that's fairly safe to say. You're hitting something that goes right to the heart of the regime in terms of how they control military, paramilitary forces. And I would not be surprised if they're going towards something even more symbolic, much closer to Ayatollah Khomeini. And I'll kind of leave it at that. So that would be my inference from what I've seen so far.
So, Joe, I got to ask you, too, because Iran is, of course, the proxy that is the head of Hezbollah. Hamas, the Houthis, every organization that we've been talking so much about over the past year. And you know what? I'm getting a new post in from Jackie Heinrich, Fox News correspondent. When asked about U.S. troops and assets in the region, a U.S. official pointed us to John Kirby's public comments that the U.S. has sufficient force posture in the region to be able to help Israel defend itself. So to be able to, and I'm getting a note from my producer here that this continues on. The U.S. has sufficient force posture in the region to be able to help Israel defend itself, and it continues and will adjust as appropriate, including if Iran decides to attack again. Kirby said, our commitment to Israel's security remains ironclad, and that means, as appropriate, make and enforce posture changes that we think need to be made to help Israel defend itself. That's what John Kirby said. So as we wait to learn more about this strike, Joe, I got to ask, from Israel's perspective, and really from the Middle Eastern perspective as a whole, how significant is it? A year ago, if you had seen news reports of Iran and Israel striking each other directly, I think we would have thought that was a pretty alarming thing to talk about. Can you put this in context for us? How significant is it that we've been watching Israel and Iran go back and forth directly with each other now twice within the past year?
Oh, it's absolutely significant. But at the same time, if you've been following this conflict or the conflicts in the region over the last few years, especially over the last few years, rather, you could say that this is inevitable. All right. We've seen this kind of shadow war between the Iranians and the Israelis in different areas of the region, especially in Syria. So I'm not surprised here. Now, what is a little bit worrying here is that it's been happening. This is not just a one-time thing, right? We've seen it in April, and now we saw it a few weeks ago. But this time, the Israelis are responding in a much more forceful way. So, again, I'm not surprised about this, but it does. I think it also spells out that not only the region is getting closer and closer to the brink of an all-out war. And I think this is what makes everybody nervous here, right? Especially Israelis, obviously the Iranians, and Washington, D.C., of course. So this is what they want to avoid. But yes, like you said earlier, a year ago, if you would have told me that that Iran was going to fire, at least in two occasions, a bunch of ballistic missiles at Israel, and then Israel would retaliate, I would have thought you were crazy, right? Yeah, even though I wouldn't be that surprised. But yeah, so here we are, right? So there's a lot going on. Again, I keep going back to this, but I'm very interested to know what the Israelis targeted and if they were successful, because I think that will spell out a possible Iranian response.
Let's bring up Lucas Tomlinson's tweet saying that in addition to Israeli airstrikes in Iran, there's also been reports of strikes in Iraq and Syria as well. Hal, when you hear Iraq and Syria, what could they be aiming for?
Oh, they're aiming for those places that might strike from there, which is, you're talking about Shiite militia groups that are over there, and I'm not surprised because they took hits in the past. There were launches of at least drones coming from both Syria and Iraq, so they're preemptively taking out those potential sites. And I will say, I saw John Kirby's comments. I found it a heck of a coincidence that an F-16 squadron from the U.S. showed up in the CENTCOM area of responsibility right before these strikes took place. I go, wow, that was some really fortuitous planning on somebody's part. So I wouldn't be surprised if there may have been some discussion, shall we say, to coordinate some actions, maybe some more expanded intelligence sharing, because these are the types of places, also Iraq and Syria, where I'd be concerned that they would attack U.S. Airbase or U.S. facilities there. Certainly where I used to be stationed at Al-Lambar Air Base, that would be one that would be high on the list of potential strikes from Shiite militia groups in Iraq. And so I imagine they may have coordinated to do some, certainly from an Israel standpoint, doing some preemptive stuff, and certainly from the U.S. standpoint, enhancing our force security posture. And I'll leave it at that. So
we are seeing from Abdul Hussein, he's also with the FDD, too many Islamist Iran octopus arms, no problem. Israel takes on Islamist Iranian targets in Iran, Iraq, Syria simultaneously. Joe, that speaks to what you and I were discussing earlier. I believe the IDF statement said 7 fronts. So really, we keep talking about this being Iran and Israel directly, but there are a lot of other factors involved in this. This is a complex operation that we're working with here, Joe.
Absolutely. And again, there are probably, I would say, at least about 28 Iran-backed groups around Israel's borders. That's a lot, and all of these organizations, they have some capabilities, right? Some have a few rockets, but others have, like the Iraqi militias, for example, or Lebanese Hezbollah. They have drones, they have ballistic missiles, they have cruise missiles. So one could say some of these groups they're armed to the teeth. So they are a problem. And separately, I do want to say that, when we hear about strikes in Syria, strikes in Iraq as well, it wouldn't surprise me here, and I've seen the Israelis do this before, that they'll strike areas, especially military targets, let's say radar installations, to essentially clear the way for the main force to come through. Okay, I'm not saying it happened here, but it's definitely possible. So that may have happened in this case. So I just wanted to bring that up. But again, there's about 28 Iran-backed groups around Israel's borders, so they have a lot to deal with here. So I'm not surprised to see some of these comments, and especially the one from Hussein, which he's absolutely correct.
Al, I got to ask you, so we're hearing that the U.S. was given advance notice before these strikes. Why does the U.S. need to know about this ahead of time?
Really, force protection. We have forces arrayed all over the Middle East, but certainly in the Persian Gulf area. It allows us to raise our shield, so to speak, if you will, certainly from an air defense standpoint, but also it allows us to position assets perhaps at sea that could potentially interdict Iranian missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones going back over to Israel. That's always proved decisive in the past. If I could add something that Joe kind of added, that's actually when you do a strike mission, one of the things you like to do is wipe out their ability to detect you en route. And of course, that means taking out air defense radars and things like that. And what's interesting is if you kind of look at the most direct route from Israel to where they would like to do probably most of the strikes, you would assume, well, they're going to fly over Jordan and probably over Saudi Arabia and maybe part of Kuwait. However, you may recall that Iran issued it's not even a veiled threat. It was just a threat to Saudi Arabia and Jordan. The other countries said, hey, if Israel overflies your airspace, we will consider you a potential threat and take action appropriately, which is another way of saying that they were threatening to strike Saudi Arabia and other countries. it may be, and this is strictly a postulation, that they may have diverted some of their airstrike capability to fly over places like Syria and Iraq. Number one is they're not going to get permission from Syria to do anything. All right. And they're probably not going to get permission from Iraq to do anything either. So they would fly over, but en route, if there were any air defense radars or air defense capabilities there that the Shiite militias held, well, they'd like to take them out. And so that is a possible, someone might even say probable scenario as to why they hit those locations. I also think, though, that a lot of it was to take out potential counterstrike capability, not just against Israel, but also counterstrike capability where they might want to hit U.S. bases, U.S. personnel, in order to limit whatever Iran is capable of doing as far as retaliation for the retaliation. And frankly, when you start going down that route, if you go back historically, it's retaliation against retaliation against retaliation. It tends to go on for a very long time. Everybody claims that they're retaliating for something. And if you've spent time actually serving over there, you can get in some very interesting conversations where I think people are still retaliating for something that happened in 1088 and stuff. So it can get a little bit long in the history as far as what that goes. But what you have is strikes, and they're trying to limit the counterstrike capability.
And Hal, I want to ask you something that Joe and I were talking about a bit ago, which is the idea that, and this builds on what you were just saying, the retaliation to the retaliation to the retaliation. Earlier this year, we saw Israel in a very similar position. They had to retaliate against Iran's first ballistic strike. How did Israel retaliate? And then how did they do it in such a way that the whole region kind of left it at that? I remember you and I talking at that time, and we kind of said after that Israel retaliation, we were like, it kind of felt like that played out as good as it possibly could because there was no Iranian response to Israel's retaliation. How did Israel pull that off earlier this year?
That was a very selective response. And what they did was pardon the expression, but they did a nuanced response. They actually took out an air defense system. It was a radar system associated with the S-300 air defense radars, which is the most advanced air defense missile system that Iran has. They don't have the S-400s from Russia. The S-300s is as much as they got. And by the way, Iran wants S-400s. I imagine that'll be top of the shopping list after whatever happened today. They'll probably go back to the Russians on that. But they took out that system. That system happened to be positioned at one of the most sensitive sites in all of Iran. All right. It was a place where they would consider themselves rather impregnable to strike or attack, and took out their air defense system. And the message was, hey, if we can take out this, what else do you think we can take out? And it was using a stealth technology to actually go in there and hit it, so they didn't know it was coming, and then all of a sudden it was gone. That was pure messaging. That was one of the more interesting strikes I've ever seen, because it was not done with a lot of kinetic destruction. It was actually done with a lot of messaging of strategic capability and strategic intent to let the Iranians know what could happen. Obviously, subtlety was a little bit lost on Tehran, so they did what they did, and everything I'm seeing so far indicates that whatever Israel just did was far, far less nuanced in terms of its delivery.
Joe, let's play a little bit of catch up here. We're looking at northern Israel right now. We know it's the early morning hours, Israel Standard Time. I believe it's around 3 in the morning. Why does northern Israel and why does southern Lebanon matter in all of this? I mean, really, it was the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. That's what really kicked this entire thing off. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, it was several things, I think, but yes, Hassan Nasrallah, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah by the Israelis. Of course, Hassan Nasrallah was the Secretary General of Lebanese Hezbollah. But also, we have to recall as well that the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, he was eliminated in Tehran by the Israelis. So that was another, and this happened several months ago, but that was a blow as far as not only to Hamas, but it really embarrassed the Iranians. Listen, you kill the head of Hamas in Tehran. That's a big deal. And it just demonstrated that the Iranians could not essentially protect one of their prized guests. So it was very embarrassing. So, the culmination, there was a lot of things going on that compelled the Iranians to essentially to attack Israel, right? So again, I think what we're trying to avoid here, at least what everyone is trying to avoid here, is as Hal was saying earlier, a response to response to response to a response. It's because it'll just be a cycle here. So I think this is what everyone's trying to avoid. But a lot of this, you can talk about Lebanon and northern Israel, or you can go all the way back to October 7th, how that really kicked everything off. So there's a lot of examples one can cite here that can say, well, this is what led to this day.
Mm-hmm. So Hal, let's talk about what's been going on in Lebanon, because this Iran-Israel direct attack at each other, this is only one facet of a much wider conflict. What has been happening in Lebanon as of late, not only in southern Lebanon, but also in the Beirut metro? What have we been seeing?
Major strikes, and they started kicking up this week. There was a period of pause with strikes that were taking place in the Beirut area. Never stopped down south. They kept striking constantly. And by the way, I should mention that the volume of these strikes is rather stunning. I mean, it's over 100 airstrikes a day, in some cases much more than 100 airstrikes a day that are taking place. And of course, they're doing the airstrikes in and around Beirut, hitting some key command and control targets, weapon caches, all sorts of different things down there. Of course, one of their tactics or whatever is to they do this rather interesting notification system, which is very extensive, where they call the area, not only the target building, but everything around the target building, and notify everybody there, we are coming in. You need to evacuate. And they give them enough time to literally pick up and get out of there before the strike takes place. It's rather unprecedented in warfare that you see something quite that extensive that's taken place, but that is one of the things they've been doing, which is kind of help keep down the collateral damage in terms of what's happening up around Beirut. But that's what's happening. Of course, today the big issue was that one of the airstrikes in southern Lebanon actually killed 3 journalists. So that's causing a lot of reverberations across the international community, but certainly the media landscape, because 3 journalists were killed in an airstrike. I'm kind of wondering what exactly they were aiming for with that airstrike. Not to say that mistakes don't happen in warfare, but there was probably something else I'm sure that they were definitely aiming for, that they thought was there. And maybe it was there, for all I know. Maybe there's a reason why the journalists were there. So that was some of the stuff that's happening. What's interesting is we talk about these strikes, and we mentioned strikes in Syria, strikes in Iraq. Why do they mention those? Because you would actually notice strikes in Syria and Iraq as being exceptional rather than the daily rule. If they said, oh, we also did strikes in Lebanon, the question is, okay, so what's different today than Tuesday? Because they've been doing constant strikes in Lebanon at such a volume that it would be difficult to actually tell, well, what was part of this and what was part of what was already going on. So it doesn't stand out quite the same way. I will be curious to see what happens in the Houthi area. That's one that I have not seen mentioned yet. It may be that we're going to hear something soon. I don't know. I haven't heard it mentioned yet, but there could have been something tied to this with dealing with the Houthis, or they could have something else that they have ready if the Houthis launch, because I would be surprised if the Houthis don't do something. When something like this happens, they will tend to launch drones or ballistic missiles that usually are not too effective. They usually get interdicted, but they could launch them. And then I would expect that we might hear something where there was another big strike mission down in Yemen hitting the Houthi areas. That would be something that would not surprise me in the least if that occurred. But again, we haven't heard that yet. But that's what's been going on in Southern Lebanon. Actually, all of Lebanon is the strike missions. One area I should point out, though, it appears the strike missions have diminished greatly, if not stopped, in northern Lebanon. That may be because they prosecuted the targets they need to prosecute up there. I'm not sure, but they have kind of pulled back from northern Lebanon, and I think some of that was also as due to some of the discussion and dialogue with the Lebanese government to pull out of some of those areas, because some of the areas they were hitting, even though they were Hezbollah targets, these were in villages that were predominantly not Shiite areas, and that was causing some serious political problems for the Lebanese government.
Joe, before I let you go here, what questions do you have about where this goes from here? Obviously, we are still awaiting what exactly Israel has struck, but I'm curious personally about how Iran will respond to this. What questions do you have?
Right. You mentioned it, right? What have the Israelis hit? And if they obviously were successful at it, and I think that will play into how Iran responds. Again, I think what everyone is looking for here is that the Israelis hit or respond to the Iranian ballistic missile attack, and it will stop there. I think that's the goal here. So I think the next few hours are very important here. But as you know, as Hal mentioned, if Iran wants to respond, it doesn't necessarily have to respond from Iran. Again, remember, it has its proxies. It's essentially its tools, right? So the Houthis in Yemen are a perfect example. The drones, the cruise missiles, the ballistic missiles. So you may see some activity from them, and also by the Iraqi militias, and then there's Syrian militias as well. And obviously, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is still a very powerful force. So a lot, again, it just goes back, depends on what the Israelis hit and what strategy the Iranians will have moving forward.
Joe, we appreciate you being generous with your time tonight. We do have to take a commercial break. We'll be back with more breaking coverage.